188 tons of steel. That is what Germany poured into a single tank. It was the heaviest armored vehicle ever built, before or since. Its gun could destroy any Allied tank on Earth from more than 2 miles away. Its armor was so thick that no Allied weapon could punch through the front. And the Germans named this monster after the smallest creature they could think of. They called it the Maus. The Maus. It was meant to be unstoppable, a rolling fortress that would crush enemy lines and turn the tide of the war. Instead, it became one of the strangest failures in military history. Not because it was weak, because it was too big to be useful. This is the story of how one man's obsession built a machine that could barely move, could not cross a single bridge in Europe, and never fired one shot in anger. This is the story of the tank that never roared. To understand the Maus, we have to go back to the summer of 1941. German tanks were rolling deep into the Soviet Union. The Blitzkrieg seemed unstoppable. The Panzer III and Panzer IV were doing their job. And then the German crews met something they were not ready for. The Soviet T-34 and the heavy KV-1 came as a shock. These were not the easy targets the Germans expected. The T-34 had sloped armor that bounced off German shells. It had wide tracks that floated over mud where German tanks sank, and it carried a gun that could kill at distances where German crews had felt safe. For the first time, the Germans were outgunned. The reports went straight up the chain of command. Germany needed something bigger, something heavier, something that could break through any defense the enemy could build.
To our channel.
In March of 1942, the order went out for a new tank in the 100-ton class. 2 weeks later, a separate contract landed on the desk of one of the most famous engineers in Germany. His name was Ferdinand Porsche. You probably know that name. Porsche designed the Volkswagen, the people's car that Hitler loved. He had also designed the Tiger, though he lost that contract to a rival firm. But Porsche had a gift for staying close to the Führer, and Hitler trusted him with his wildest ideas. So when Hitler dreamed of a giant breakthrough tank, a tank that could smash through fortified lines like a battering ram, he turned to Porsche. The early design carried a fitting name. They called it the Mammoth. The Mammoth. By December of 1942, somebody with a sense of humor renamed it the Mäuschen, the Little Mouse, and by February of 1943, it had its final name, the Maus. There is something almost funny about it. The biggest tank ever conceived, named after a mouse. But nobody in Germany was laughing at what it was supposed to do. On the 1st of May, 1943, Porsche presented a full-sized wooden model to Hitler and his generals. It towered over the men standing beside it, and almost everyone in that room was dazzled. They saw a magnificent giant, a war-winning weapon, a symbol of German power that would terrify the enemy. Almost everyone. There was one man who was not impressed. His name was Heinz Guderian, the general who had invented German blitzkrieg tactics. Guderian knew tanks better than anyone in that room, and he thought the Maus was madness. He later wrote that the weight was supposed to reach 175 tons. With Hitler's changes, it would reach 200. And he wrote one line that says everything. Except for him, every man present found the Maus magnificent. Guderian had a sharp eye for the flaws. He noticed the early design had no machine gun for close defense. None at all. He had seen this exact mistake before, with the Elephant tank destroyer at the Battle of Kursk. Those vehicles had no way to fight off enemy infantry up close. Soviet soldiers swarmed them and destroyed them. Guderian was not going to let that happen again. Because of his protests, the Maus finally got machine guns and pistol ports added for close defense. But Guderian's deeper warning went unheard. Let us talk about what they were actually building, because the Maus was a marvel of engineering, even if it was a useless one. The main gun was a 128mm cannon, the same monster gun used in the Jag Tiger tank destroyer. It that could destroy any Allied tank in service at the time, some of them at ranges beyond 3.5 kilometers. That is more than 2 miles. At
that distance, the enemy crew would never even see what hit them. Next to the main gun sat a second cannon, a 75mm weapon mounted right beside it. On top of the turret was a machine gun. This was a tank that could fight at every range at once. But the armor is where the Maus truly defied belief. The front of the hull was 200mm thick. The front of the turret reached 220. The gun mantlet, the thickest part, was 250mm of solid steel. To put that in perspective, the famous Tiger tank had just 100mm on its front. The Maus carried more than twice that. Its armor was thicker than the plating on some warships. No Allied gun on Earth could crack the front of this thing head-on. On paper, it was indestructible, and that is exactly the word Hitler had used when he ordered it. So we have a tank with a gun that kills anything, and armor that nothing can pierce. It sounds perfect. And then you look at the numbers that mattered, the numbers that killed it. The Maus weighed 188 tons in battle. Hitler liked to round it up to 200. For comparison, the standard German tank of the early war, the Panzer III, weighed about 25 tons. The Maus weighed nearly 8 times as much. It was over 10 meters long and stood almost 4 meters tall, twice as long as a normal tank, and so high it could be spotted from a distance by any gunner or aircraft. Now, here is the problem nobody could solve. What engine do you put in a machine that heavy? Porsche chose a hybrid system, clever for its time. A huge aircraft engine would spin a generator, and that electricity would drive electric motors connected to the tracks. It was the same idea Porsche had used in his earlier vehicles. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, it was hopeless. The engine simply could not move all that steel. The Maus was designed to reach 20 kilometers an hour. During real testing, on a good hard surface, it managed about 13. Off-road, it was far slower. Let me put that in terms you can feel. The Maus had a power-to-weight ratio of about 6 horsepower per ton. A normal family car has far more punch than that. Germany's most fearsome tank moved slower than a man could ride a bicycle, and it drank fuel like a thirsty giant. And fuel was the cruelest joke of all. By the time the Maus was being built, Germany was running out of oil. The army did not have enough fuel for the tanks it already owned. And here was Porsche, building a machine that guzzled fuel by the barrel and could only travel about 160 kilometers on a full tank on a road. Off-road, that range collapsed to barely 60 kilometers. A weapon that cannot reach the battle is no weapon at all. But the worst problem, the one that truly doomed the Maus, was getting it anywhere in the first place. Think about it. 188 tons. There was not a single road bridge in Europe that could hold that weight. Not one. If a Maus drove onto a bridge, the bridge would collapse beneath it. So how do you move it? You cannot drive it far, because it breaks down and burns fuel. You cannot put it on a normal train, because no railway car could carry something that long and heavy. Porsche had to design a special railway carriage just for this tank. It rode on 14 axles and stretched nearly 27 meters long. And even that monster carriage had a flaw. It was so wide and so tall that it could not pass through many railway tunnels or under many bridges. So every time they moved the Maus by rail, the route had to dodge tunnels and low bridges entirely. Now we get to the part that sounds completely made up. Since the Maus could not cross any bridge, the engineers came up with another plan. The Maus would cross rivers by going under them. Yes, under them. For shallow streams, it could just wade through. But for deep rivers, the crew would seal the tank shut and drive it straight across the river bottom, completely submerged, up to 8 meters underwater. The crew would breathe through a giant snorkel that stuck up to the surface like a chimney. There was just one catch. While submerged, the engine could not run properly underwater. So the plan required 2 Maus tanks working
If you're
together.
a fan of military
One tank
technology
would sit
and
on the
World War
riverbank
II history,
and feed electrical
please
power
consider
through a long
subscribing
cable
to our
to
channel.
the second tank
It would help
crawling
us
along the bottom
tremendously.
of the river.
Thank you.
Picture that. 2 of the heaviest machines ever built, one drowning itself in a river, connected by a power cord, while the crew breathes through a pipe. That was the official solution, and it tells you everything about how impractical this whole project was. Despite all of this, they actually built it. Krupp made the hull, the turret, and the guns. A firm called Alket handled the final assembly near Berlin. Just before Christmas of 1943, the first prototype was finished. It had no real turret yet, just a heavy steel weight bolted on to imitate one. They called this first machine the V1. The early test drives were promising in one strange way. For such a giant, the Maus steered with surprising ease, thanks to that electric drive. Porsche's own driver took it out and found it smooth to control, but the deeper truth showed up fast. In January of 1944, they shipped the V1 by rail to a testing ground at Böblingen, near Stuttgart, carefully avoiding every tunnel along the way, and that is where the Maus showed its true nature. One day, the tank set out across the proving ground to test its cross-country ability. The driver, who did not know every patch of the terrain, rolled into a soft, boggy stretch of ground. The lighter tanks crossed that bog with no trouble at all, but for the 180-ton Maus, it was a trap. The giant sank into the earth more than 1.5 meters deep. It was stuck fast. Ferdinand Porsche himself came to the scene with his engineers, and there was nothing they could do. They stood there and looked at their helpless monster, buried in the mud, too heavy to be pulled out by anything around it. That image says more than any report could. The greatest tank ever built, sunk in a field, defeated not by the enemy, but by a patch of wet ground. By this point, the project was already falling apart behind the scenes. The opposition to the Maus ran right to the top of German industry. General Guderian was against it. So was Albert Speer, the man in charge of war production. Speer thought it was too heavy, too slow, and would not be ready until late in the war. He and Guderian both wanted it killed. But there was one man whispering the other way. Speer's own deputy, Karl Otto Sauer, secretly wanted his boss's job. And Sauer knew how to please Hitler. When Hitler grew excited about the Maus, Sauer fed that excitement. He talked up the tank's chances and the glory of new wonder weapons, and Hitler, dreaming of unstoppable giants, loved it. He once turned to Porsche and exclaimed that with 100 of these tanks, he could turn back the Russians. 100 of them. Think about what that would have cost. Each Maus swallowed the steel, the labor, and the money that could have built many smaller tanks. While Germany faced thousands of Soviet T-34s rolling toward its borders, Hitler dreamed of a handful of giants, and the dream only grew. After being told about the Maus, Hitler was soon talking about tanks weighing 1,500 tons, land battleships that would sail across the steppes of Russia. These were fantasies, pure and simple, but they ate up the time and talent of Germany's best engineers in the years when Germany could least afford it. The order kept shrinking as reality set in. At first, they wanted 150 of these tanks. Then Guderian stepped in and cut the order down to just 5, so they could be tested before anyone built more. Then production was halted. By August of 1944, Krupp stopped all work on the Maus. The dream was over. In the end, only 2 hulls and 1 real turret were ever finished. A second prototype, the V2, was completed in the spring of 1944. It received the only real turret, fitted with the full armament, and later a more powerful diesel engine. For a while, both giants sat at the testing grounds, running their trials, moving under their own power, going nowhere that mattered. By the second half of 1944, both of them were moved to the Army Testing Center at Kummersdorf, south of Berlin. And there they waited as the war closed in around them.
By the spring of 1945, the war was lost. The Soviet Red Army was driving toward Berlin. The two Maus prototypes sat at Kummersdorf with no hope of escape. They were far too heavy to evacuate, and there was no fuel and no time. The Germans had to make a choice. They could not let these machines fall into Soviet hands intact. So German engineers set explosives. Inside the V2, the one with the real turret and the working guns, they blew it up. The blast wrecked the engine and tore into the hull, but they did not manage to destroy both. When Soviet troops overran Kummersdorf in late April of 1945, they found the first prototype, the V1, sitting there abandoned and almost fully intact. Its engine still worked. The Soviets could hardly believe what they had captured. They ran firing trials against the tank, shooting at its sides and front to test that famous armor. Then they decided to take the best of both machines home. They used 6 captured German heavy half-tracks, the largest Germany ever built, just to lift the 55-ton turret off the destroyed V2. Then they mated that turret onto the intact V1 hull, creating one complete hybrid Maus from the wreckage of 2. That single surviving tank was loaded onto its special railway carriage and shipped east. It reached the Soviet proving ground at Kubinka, near Moscow, in the spring of 1946. There, Soviet engineers took it apart piece by piece to learn its secrets. They stripped out the engine, the electric motors, and the transmission, leaving an empty armored shell. And that shell still stands today in a museum at Kubinka. If you go there, you can walk right up to it. The heaviest tank ever built, sitting quietly in a corner, a hollow monument to a terrible idea. A single gun sight, meant for the wooden mock-up turret, was captured by the British. It rests in the Tank Museum at Bovington, in England. So what do we make of the Maus? Here was a tank with the most powerful gun of its kind, wrapped in armor no enemy could pierce, designed by one of the most brilliant engineers of the age, and it accomplished absolutely nothing. It never fought a single battle. It never fired one round at an enemy. The only shots it ever took were from Soviet gunners testing its armor after the war was over. The lesson of the Maus is the same lesson Germany kept learning the hard way. Raw power means nothing if you cannot bring it to bear. A weapon that cannot reach the battlefield is just a very expensive paperweight. The Maus could destroy anything in front of it, but it could not cross a bridge. It could not drive far without breaking down. It could not be moved without a special train that dodged every tunnel. It could not even pull itself out of a muddy field, and it drank fuel that Germany no longer had. There is something almost tragic in it. The men who built the Maus were not fools. They were among the finest engineers in the world, but they were chasing a dream that could never come true, ordered by a leader who confused size with strength. While Hitler dreamed of land battleships, the war was being won by thousands of cheaper, faster, simpler tanks that could actually get where they needed to go. The Maus was not too small. It was far, far too big. In the end, the Maus tells us less about engineering and more about obsession, about what happens when a nation pours its genius into a fantasy instead of a need. 188 tons of Germany's finest steel, the most powerful tank gun of the war, and armor that nothing could defeat. And it all came to nothing. The Maus never roared. It never even reached the fight. If you enjoyed this story about Hitler's monster tank, give this video a like. Tell us in the comments which incredible war machine you would like us to cover next, and subscribe so you never miss another story from the strangest corners of military history. Thanks for watching.